Just imagine this for a moment. Long before our cities existed, before roads, buildings, and skylines, entire civilizations lived, worked, and died on the very ground beneath your feet. Some lived hundreds of years ago. Some lived thousands. Some lived so long ago, we are only just beginning to understand who they were. And when they died, they were all buried. But the dead don't always stay still. Because as populations grew, cities expanded, and land became valuable, burial grounds were erased, relocated, ignored, or simply built over, again and again and again. Today, millions of people live, work, raise families on the land that was once a cemetery. In many cases, the bodies were never even moved. Nowhere does this really reveal itself more clearly than New York City. Nearly every park, square, and open space in Manhattan was once a burial ground. At one point, burials were local and informal. Churches, farms, and public lands served as cemeteries. When disease swept through the city, yellow fever, cholera, smallpox, the dead accumulated faster than the living could manage. Union Square is now a vibrant public plaza, served as a burial ground from the 1790s all the way through the early 1800s. This area around 14th Street was used primarily to bury the poor. Bellevue Hospital, then known as Bellevue Farm, buried patients there during yellow fever outbreaks. The land was completely reimagined, reshaped, and sold, but the bodies beneath it were never fully removed. What appears today as just a civic gathering space still conceals hundreds, possibly thousands, of forgotten burials. New York City is not just built on buried history. It's layers and layers of it. Long before skyscrapers defined the skyline, burial grounds filled nearly every open space. By the mid-1800s, the city faced a crisis. There was no more room for the dead. In 1851, a law was passed forbidding new burials below 86th Street, but by then, tens of thousands of bodies were already underground. So rather than relocating them properly, development simply continued. Entire neighborhoods, parks, streets, and landmarks were constructed directly on top of the cemeteries, often with the bodies left exactly where they were. Washington Square Park is one of New York's largest mass burial sites. From roughly 1797 to 1825, the land held thousands of nameless graves. And when the residents moved into what is now Greenwich Village, the burial ground was closed and transformed into a public park. Today, it's believed that more than 20,000 bodies remain buried beneath the park, directly below paths, fountains, and playgrounds. Before becoming Jimmy Walker Park, this land was St. John's Cemetery, the burial ground of Trinity Church. While some graves were reportedly relocated to another Trinity-owned site at 155th Street and Broadway, historians estimate that approximately 10,000 bodies were never removed. The park now exists as a public recreation space. When the land became desirable, the cemetery was closed, the headstones removed, and the dead left behind. At one point, city officials discussed using the remains as fertilizer. Madison Square Park was once a burial ground from around 1794 to 1797. The bodies were removed from this area and they were transferred to Washington Square Park, which was also a cemetery at the time. However, many remains were never relocated. At one point, the park is believed to have held at least 125,000 graves, and according to historians, over 20,000 bodies are still likely buried there today. And near the Federal Reserve, the Little Green Street Burial Ground served as the first burial site for New York's Quaker congregation from the late 1600s through the early 1820s. This cemetery was eventually built over entirely. Another Quaker burial ground on East Houston Street served as the primary cemetery during the city's 1820s boom. Today, that site is a supermarket with no visible trace of the bodies beneath it. One of the most important burial discoveries in North American history lies beneath Lower Manhattan. The African burial ground, located near Duane Street and Elk Street beneath 290 Broadway, dates back to the early 1600s. It was in 1991, during the construction of the federal office building, that workers uncovered skeletal remains nearly 30 feet below street level. Evacuations revealed at least 6 acres of burial grounds containing nearly 15,000 intact remains. Some estimates suggest more than 20,000 people were originally buried there. In 1788, bodies from this burial ground were illegally exhumed for medical experimentation. And as New York expanded in the 19th century, department stores, government buildings, and neighborhoods were constructed directly over the graves. Their graves were paved over by government buildings, stores, and streets for nearly 400 years. Park Avenue, now one of the wealthiest streets in the world, once housed Manhattan's largest public cemetery. Coffins lined the streets during the removal. Many bodies were transferred, but many were not. The Waldorf Astoria now stands on that land. Throughout New York, cemeteries were not erased because they were forgotten. They were erased because the land became valuable. In Connecticut, New Haven Green contains more than nearly 10,000 early settlers. When Center Church was built in 1812, the headstones were removed, but the bodies were left beneath the floor. Today, visitors walk through a public park above thousands of unmarked graves. In Massachusetts, Mount Auburn Cemetery introduced the idea of cemeteries as landscape parks. But even this innovation couldn't prevent overcrowding, abandonment, and reuse. Throughout New England, small family plots were absorbed into expanding cities. Once the families were gone, the graves followed. In Virginia, Leesburg uncovered hundreds of graves in the 1980s. Mostly African American. The remains were bulldozed into a mass vault labeled as unknown citizens. Decades later, the same land was disturbed again for commercial development. In Alabama, Jefferson County alone is believed to contain more than 400 cemeteries, many of them hidden, unmarked, or forgotten. In Florida, the Dozier School for Boys concealed hundreds of children buried in unmarked graves, and many of them died from abuse, neglect, or violence. Most of it was never reported and never investigated. Nearby, Zion Cemetery in Tampa lay directly beneath public housing. Ground-penetrating radar revealed hundreds of coffins belonging to African Americans buried during segregation. The cemetery had been erased to make way for development. These graves were not lost by accident. They were buried by policy. Also in Florida, 168 skeletal remains were found in Wendover Pond, dating back to 8000 BC. This was discovered during road construction. This was the largest archaic period burial site ever found. In Illinois, Chicago's Lincoln Park was once a cemetery holding over 35,000 bodies. Most were supposedly relocated, but construction continues to uncover remains to this day. At O'Hare Airport, runways expanded into historic burial grounds. Families were given the option to move their dead, but only if they could prove next of kin. In Iowa, a condominium project uncovered nearly 900 unmarked graves, all belonging to an early Catholic cemetery that had never been relocated. Highways, railroads, airports, modern infrastructure often follows the path of least resistance, and cemeteries were easy to erase. In Washington, D.C., the Walter C. Pierce Community Park was built over 2 African American cemeteries, once the largest in the city. Research suggests 8,000 bodies still remain there. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, there's a suspected mass grave from the 1921 race massacre. There's open land with no headstones, and it's believed to hide hundreds of victims. California may contain more lost cemeteries than any other state. In San Francisco, 4 massive cemeteries, known as the Big Four, once covered 70 square blocks. Bodies were exhumed, dumped, relocated, or left behind. Today, homes, museums, and playgrounds sit on top of them. The Legion of Honor Museum was built atop Golden Gate Cemetery. Workers uncovered dozens of coffins daily. Bodies were bulldozed into a mass gravesite. It was reported that even the jewelry was stolen from the corpses. In Los Angeles, Cathedral High School sits on former cemetery land as well. Graves are still continuing to surface beneath the athletic fields. In Colma, California, the dead outnumber the living 1,000 to 1. California didn't move its dead, it exported them. At Paradise Memorial Park in Santa Fe Springs, families began noticing missing headstones, often replaced with new markers. Investigations revealed cemetery operators illegally exhumed bodies, resold plots, and stacked multiple corpses in single graves. The operators were convicted, but the bodies remained disturbed and disrespected. At Founders Memorial Park, also known as Dead Man's Park in Los Angeles, this park was built over 2 cemeteries, Mount Olive Cemetery and Broadway Cemetery. These contained more than 1,200 burials, and after years of neglect, the land was declared a public nuisance in 1958. Bodies remain beneath the park still to this day. At Sheffield Cemetery in England, there's 87,000 burials, and all of the gravestones were bulldozed, but the bodies still remain beneath the park today. In Australia, the Queen Victoria Market in Melbourne is built over an 1830s cemetery, and the bodies lie just inches below the ground. Just recently in Ireland, nearly 800 infants were found buried in a septic tank at a former mother and baby home, and there's not a single burial record. At the Shanghai Disney Resort, hundreds of graves were relocated, and the families were reportedly paid less than $50 per grave. Across prisons, universities, railroads, dams, highways, shopping centers, schools, homes, the same pattern repeats itself. Cemeteries fill, they are neglected, they are erased, and the dead are completely built over. This isn't an American problem either. It's a human one. In London, graves are leased, not owned. After 75 to 100 years, remains may be reused, stacked, or reduced to make room for the next burial. In Paris, Overflowing cemeteries forced officials to move 6 million skeletons into underground tunnels they call the catacombs of Paris. In Germany, Singapore, and in much of Europe, graves are temporary unless families continue to pay for them. Globally, 55 million people die every year. Cemeteries are businesses. When they fill up, income stops, maintenance ends, and the abandonment begins. Without laws protecting forgotten burial grounds, the development will continue. Ground-penetrating radar is now revealing what records erased, and as cities expand, more graves will surface. Maybe beneath a school, a grocery store, a home, because the truth is simple and unsettling. No matter where you live, no matter how new the building feels, you're probably living on top of the dead. And one day, someone will build on top of you. And yet, even when graves are discovered, even when bones surface, even when history is forced back into the light, most of the time, nothing truly changes. Construction pauses, investigations are launched, and reports are written. Then the ground is sealed once again. The remains are cataloged, boxed, relocated, or sometimes quietly reburied just a few feet away. A plaque may be installed, a marker placed, a brief acknowledgement offered, and life goes on. Cars drive past, children play, buildings rise, and the dead return to silence. Across the United States, there is no centralized database for forgotten cemeteries. No records to show where the dead were or left behind. Each discovery is treated as an isolated event, an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a history to be reckoned with. Thousands of burial grounds remain undocumented. Many exist only in fading land deeds, oral histories, or family memory. Others were never recorded at all. And when no one is left to remember, no one is left to object. In many cases, the people buried beneath our cities were the poor, the enslaved, the imprisoned, the institutionalized, and the unwanted. Those without land, without wealth, and without voices. History does not seem to bury the dead evenly. Those with power are preserved in stone and marble, and those without are absorbed into the soil. Every excavation tells the same story. A road crew uncovers bones. A developer stumbles onto coffins. A backhoe reveals skulls where no one expected them. And with each discovery comes the same question: how did we not know? But perhaps the more honest question is, how often did we choose not to know? For centuries, progress has required forgetting. Cities expanded because cemeteries were seen as obstacles. Infrastructure moved forward because the dead could not protest. Neighborhoods were built because no one claimed what lay beneath. And so the cycle continued: bury, build, and forget. Even now, as technology allows us to see deeper into the earth than ever before, development rarely slows. Ground-penetrating radar may reveal anomalies, but interruption is optional. Investigation costs money. Delays cost profit. And the dead do not vote. There's a quiet irony to modern cities, really. We fear death. We sanitize it. We push it out of sight, yet we live directly on top of it. Under our homes, under our streets, under our foundations. Entire lives compressed into layers beneath concrete. Somewhere below you right now, there may be a name once spoken every day, a child once carried, a family member once loved, someone who believed they were being laid to rest. Because burial was never meant to be temporary, and yet history has proven otherwise. Graves move, stones vanish, markers crumble, and eventually, even memory erodes. One day, far in the future, the buildings we know now will be gone. The streets will crack, the foundations will collapse, and someone else will dig. They will uncover what is left behind. Fragments, bones, evidence of lives lived long before them. And they will ask the same question we ask now. Who were these people? The answer will depend on whether we choose to remember, or whether once again, we build over the truth.